Parsha opens up with the words Vayechi Yaakov Eretz Mitzrayim Shvas Reishana, so that Yaakov lived in Eretz Mitzrayim 17 years, and his whole life was 147 years. He died in Mitzrayim. Then the whole story of how they took his bones, they took his body back to Hebron to bury him in the Ma'aseh Machpelah. Very interesting Ramban right at the beginning of the Parsha, one of the first, I think maybe the first piece of Ramban in the Parsha. It says, interesting, yesterday we look at Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu came to Mitzrayim, why ki ein mira l'tzayin? He told Paro, we have no way to pasture our sheep, our flocks. Back in Canaan, there's no food there, nothing's growing, there's a terrible drought. We came to Mitzrayim because we heard that in Mitzrayim we have place for our sheep, we have place for our animals, and we can continue to prosper and we continue to live until the situation gets better. What actually happened, says the Ramban, the situation got better. Even we know from Chazal that as soon as Yaakov came, the drought stopped, and there was plenty of food. For sure, after 5 years, everything stopped. They were able to go back to Canaan, but no, they stayed, and Yaakov died in Eretz Mitzrayim. He did not go back to Canaan, as he told Pari that he came temporarily. He came, and the Golus began. The Golus Mitzrayim began, and by the time the Yidden did want to leave, it was already too late, and Pari already did not let them leave, and they were working Avodas Perach, and the whole story of Golus Mitzrayim started. It says the Ramban, this is a foreshadow of what's going to happen in the final Golus, the Golus that we're involved in right now. The Ramban quotes history. We know this. This is confirmed by Josephus and by history books and by Chazal themselves, who say that the Yidden did not start their relationship with Rome by the Churban Habayis, by the destruction of the temple. No, the relationship with the Jews started much earlier, and it started on pleasant terms. They created bonds with the Romans. They signed treaties with the Romans. There was treaties between the Jews and the Romans. They wouldn't fight. They would be subjected to them. They put themselves, says the Ramban, into the goals, just as Yaakov put himself and the entire family of Klal Yisrael, of Bnei Yisrael, and furthermore Klal Yisrael, put themselves into the Golus Mitzrayim. The same thing happened in the Golus Rami and the Golus Edom that we are found today. We put ourselves into that Golus, and when the Romans threw us out of Eretz Yisrael, then we're ready. We have no choice. But it all started with our own hands. If we follow the history, we can see that the Yidden themselves created the Golus for themselves. The Ramban was written hundreds of years ago, more than 500 years ago, the words of the Ramban, but how true they are today, in a time when the world is free, when most of the people of the world, and definitely the Jews of the world, live in free countries, and people are free to make their own choices, to live in one place or to live in another place. And yet, so many millions of Yidden, obviously myself included, live still in Golos, and everybody has their own reasons why we don't live in Eretz Yisrael. We have the Heilige Land, Eretz HaKadoshah. Anybody can pick themselves up and move to Eretz Yisrael, and yet millions of people still don't live in Eretz Yisrael. And again, not coming to judge, definitely not judge myself, and not judge any of you, and anybody who's living not in Eretz Yisrael. But the fact is, the words of the Ramban ring clear, that we have to realize that we are in Golos. We should realize that we're in Golos. We should realize that we are lacking. We are lacking. Something is terribly lacking when we live in Chutz La'aretz. Even in Chutz La'aretz, something is terribly lacking. And of course, Kal V'Chomer, Ben B'nai Shel Kal V'Chomer, how lacking we are without the Mashiach and without the Geula. And sometimes we feel ourselves too comfortable. The legendary Rabbi Eliyahu SS, many of you may know, he ran the underground movement of Torah learning and Shmiras HaMitzvahs in the Soviet Union. He himself was a refusnik. He applied for permission to leave, immediately was fired, and immediately was excluded from all Soviet life. And he lived the life of a refusnik for many, many years before he finally had permission to leave. I had the opportunity to speak to him not long ago, and he asked me on the phone, so, tell me, what are you still doing in Moscow? What could there be in Moscow to do better than in Eretz Yisrael? Why do the Yidden still not live in Eretz Yisrael? Don't be insulted. I asked this question not only to you, but to any Jews living in Chutz La'aretz. And then he told me an interesting story. He said, once I was in London, and there was a group of Rabbanim, and we were meeting, and we were discussing my life as a refusnik. Obviously, very, very interesting story that he had to tell. And then he asked the Rabbanim, he said, I don't understand you. I was a refusnik. I fought with my own blood and tears to leave the Soviet Union, to come to Eretz Yisrael, to live in Eretz Yisrael. And you're living here in London. Anybody of you can decide today, tomorrow to leave, and you still decide on your own to stay in London. And one of the Rabbanim there said, well, you know, we have a community, we have a shul, we have responsibilities, the captain leaves the ship last, you know how it is. And all the Rabbanim were answering, and there was one Rav there, Rav Gershon Lapian, Zechat Tzaddik Levracha, and he banged his fist on the table and he says, Chevra, my dear friends, tell the man the truth. We're in England because it's comfortable to be in England. We're in London because it's comfortable to be in London. The reason why we don't pick ourselves up and move to Eretz Yisrael is because we think it's going to be difficult to live there. We don't start giving excuses. We have to be here. We should be here. We don't have to be here. The truth is that we're too comfortable in Golas. And whether a person decides, with the advice of Gedolei Yisrael and their Rabbeim, that their place is to be in Chutz La'aretz, or whether their person decides that he should pick himself and move to Eretz Yisrael, but one thing is clear, the words of the Ramban ring true today as they rang clear 500-600 years ago when he wrote them. Sometimes Yidden create the Golos for themselves. If we would realize how lacking we are, if we would realize how much we're missing without the Shekhinah in Eretz Yisrael, how much we're missing without Mashiach, how much more we would hope and we would daven and we would do all we can to get out of this Golos and not create the Golos with our own hands. We should be Zeichen to Chazak v'nis Chazek. It's a Shabbos Chazak. We should have a lot of Chizuk. And we should be Zeicha, that we should really want Mashiach, we should really want the Geula to come, and we should want the Golos, and at the very minimum, we should not create the Golos with our own hands. Good Shabbos.